In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a seam and also how to edge finish your seam allowance using 4 different techniques: pinking shears, zigzag, 3-step zigzag, and the turned and stitched or clean finish method. On any sewing project, you'll have seams. They're the things that keep your pieces of fabric held together. And when you make a seam, you'll be given a specific seam allowance, which will tell you how far away from the raw edge you need to sew that seam. On a lot of commercial sewing patterns, the seam allowance will be 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch. So I'll be showing you how to work with seam allowances of 1.5 centimetres and also ways in which you can edge finish the seam allowances to stop them from fraying. To make my seam samples, I'm using some scraps of fabric which are approximately 5 centimetres or 2 inches wide by around 15 centimetres in length or 6 inches long. Once you've cut your pieces, place them right sides together, matching the raw edges. And then if you feel you need to, place some pins to hold the fabric together. I like to place my pins perpendicular to the edge or at a right angle so that it makes it quicker for me to take the pins out as I'm working, or I can just sew straight over the pins. I'm going to show you first how to sew a basic seam on your sewing machine. You'll want to set your machine to a straight stitch with a stitch length of around 2.5. On my Janome machine, I've set my stitch selector to the straight stitch here, and the stitch length is at 2.5, and that's a standard setting length for most of the stitching you're going to do on your sewing machine. When I make my seams, I'm going to be following this 15 line here on the needle plate. That indicates a measurement of 15 millimeters from the needle. If you don't have markings like this on your needle plate, you can use masking tape or painter's tape to measure from the needle the right distance away, and then use a piece of masking tape as a guide instead. Or if you want to make really sure that you're aiming for the right place, just use the masking tape anyway. Line the raw edge of your fabric up with your marked line, and then lower the presser foot. You want to make sure that the needle will enter the fabric, so you can test that by just taking the needle into the fabric using the hand wheel and turning it by hand. Then I'm going to do a few stitches forwards and backwards to secure the stitches. This is often referred to as back tacking, so you'll need to locate the reverse lever or button on your machine. When you come towards the pins, you can either take them out or just sew straight over them. Not everyone likes to do that though. When you reach the end of the seam, you'll want to back tack again. So once you get to the end, take a few stitches backwards and then forwards to secure. Take the needle out of the fabric, raise the presser foot, and then pull your fabric out to the left, and you can cut the threads on your cutter that's located on the side of the machine. If you have issues pulling the threads out, or if you're finding there's 2 or 3 threads that come away as you pull your fabric, just check that your needle position is as high as it will go, and just turn the hand wheel a little further to raise the needle out of the fabric, and then pull on the threads again to remove that from the machine. Now that your seam's complete, you can take out the pins and then cut the threads as well. And that's the seam done. Next, I'm going to show you a variety of different seam finishes, and each will start in a similar way to this. The first seam finish is the easiest and just involves a pair of scissors. And I'm going to use these pinking shears. These have got the zigzag blades. This seam finish works best on fabrics which don't fray too easily, so stable woven fabrics like this cotton, for example. Just trim the very edge off, don't trim too much off, just work your way all the way along, and then once I've done that I'll just go over to the iron and press open the seam allowances with the iron to make them nice and flat. The next seam finish I'm going to show you is how to zigzag on each side of the seam allowance. On my machine I'm going to change the stitch selector to the zigzag and then pick the right settings for that. So I'm going to use a medium width of zigzag, so a width of about 3, and I'm going to shorten the zigzag to just slightly less than 2. I've already made my seam for this sample, and what I want to do next is to edge finish each of the seam allowances using the zigzag stitch. On your projects you may wish to zigzag the seam allowances together depending on the weight of your fabric, but for thicker fabrics, to get the flattest result, it's best to do them separately and press the seam open. To align the fabric correctly to zigzag in the right place, you'll need to use the hand wheel. What I generally do is to position the fabric underneath the presser foot and then turn the hand wheel towards me to see where the needle's going to go in to the left of the stitch, and then turn it away from me to see where the needle's going to go to the right on the stitch. So I want to position it so that when the stitch goes over to the right, it's going to be touching just the inside of this edge, and so once I'm happy that that's the correct position, then I can lower the presser foot and start to sew. And as before, I will back tack a little to get started. So when I'm doing the zigzag edge, I don't have a line that I'm following on the needle plate here. You might wish to move your masking tape over to give yourself a guide, or just try and feed it in by eye and just make sure the fabric's being caught over the edge. And then when I get to the end, back tack again, and then pull that out and cut the threads, or use the thread cutter on the side of the machine. So you can see the edge of the fabric there is neatly zigzagged, and I've caught right at the edge. So I'm going to work down the other side of the seam allowance next, positioning as before. And then I'll go to the iron. If you notice any fraying strands on this zigzagged one, you can always trim some of those off with a sharp pair of scissors. So you can see there the edge finish of the zigzag stitching on both sides of the seam allowances, and you'll notice that it starts to roll that edge a little bit, and that does often happen with lighter weight fabrics when using the zigzag. So the next seam finish I'm going to show you is something that you can do to avoid this happening. The next seam finish that I'm going to do is a 3-step zigzag, and it's going to sit on the edge of the seam allowance, both seam allowances as before, but this time the zigzag stitch takes 3 stitches to form each of the sides of the zigzag. And this works really well for lightweight fabrics where you want to avoid the edge of the fabric being rolled like it was in the previous example. I'll need to change the settings again on my machine, and this time I'm looking for the 3-step zigzag, which I've got here. So I'll turn my stitch selector to the 3-step zigzag, and then I'll need to adjust my width of the stitch slightly and the length. So making a shorter stitch with a wider width. I'm going to position the stitch as I did before and just want to make sure where it's going to sew as it performs the 3 steps. I think it's probably going to be about there on the edge. So you can use the hand wheel again just to test. So I know that that's going to just need moving over just a tiny bit, and then I'm okay to start. So as before, just do a little bit of back tacking to secure, and then hold that in position and work your way down to the end. So you can see the zigzag forms and it doesn't pull the edge of the fabric. I'm going to repeat that on the other side. You can see on this sample I've got my 3-step zigzag on each of the seam allowances sitting right on the edge, stopping that from fraying. And again, I'll take it over to the iron and give it a press to make that nice and flat. The 4th type of seam finish I'm going to show you in this video is either called a clean finish or turned and stitched, because I turn and stitch the seam allowance to stop it from fraying. If you want to, you can take this over to the iron first, press it flat, and then turn under each of the seam allowances. So you want to be turning it under in half, aligning the raw edge with your original stitch line and pressing that in place like so. And then doing the same on the other side, turning that seam allowance under, folding it in half and pressing that in place. So I'm going to do that first and prepare that over at the ironing board. Fold your seam allowance over to meet with your stitching line, and then you can press that in half. You might want to pin it or just beware of your fingers and do it in this way. And I can fold that back over and then repeat with the other side. So folding that over, folding that into the middle so it meets with the stitch line or just shy of it. And then give it a final press, pressing it open again. Just watch your fingers. Now that I've prepared my seam allowances for stitching, I'm going to make sure that my machine is turned back to doing a straight stitch, and then I'm going to sew down the centre of each of these seam allowances, catching the underside folded section at the same time. If you find it easier and you want to make sure that you are going to catch this as you stitch, you can sew from the underside. So I'll do that on this example. I'm going to place the fabric so it's underneath the presser foot, and the centre of the presser foot and the needle is going to be in the middle of the folded section. I'm going to back tack to start and then just run the length of the piece to the other end and back tack at the other end. If you find it gets stuck, just use the threads at the back to pull it through the machine to get it started. Sometimes it does jam. That's one side done, and then I'm going to run down the other seam allowance from the underside again. So making sure that you're sewing only through the seam allowance. This doesn't want to be seen on the right side of your fabric. And that's my turned and stitched or clean finish one completed. You could give it an extra press at the end to embed those stitches. In my next video, I'll show you another technique of how to finish your seam allowance to give a much more professional looking finish.